And welcome everybody who's joined today. It's going to be, I'm sure, an extremely interesting learning lab. My name is Annie Holmes and I'm with the STRIVE Research Consortium. We've been in business for nearly 8 years now. We had a 6-year grant and a 2-year extension to look into the structural drivers of HIV, how these factors hamper efforts to prevent or treat HIV, and what can be done to overcome them. Today we look at the co-financing work that STRIVE has done with our affiliate UNDP and learn about what the model involves, the mechanism, and how it's and progress on trying to implement it with UNDP in 7 countries. Our presenter today is Teresa Guthrie, who's a health economist from South Africa with 16 years experience, over 16 years experience with public health finance systems in Africa, specifically costing, budgeting, and financing health interventions across a range of issues from HIV, TB, nutrition and others, and working with public health finance systems with PEPFAR and the Global Fund funding system, as well as UNAIDS agencies looking at that goal that we all want of value for money analysis. I'm going to hand over now to Teresa. Welcome, Teresa, and thanks so much for offering this really important presentation.
Great, thank you, Annie, and thank you for this opportunity. It's a delight to present some of the work that I've been doing with UNDP and with Doug Webb, who will also jump in towards the end of the presentation. So thank you. This is a pilot that UNDP has been working on for about 2 years. Actually started earlier with an initial workshop in 2015. But really kind of got going in the last 2 years and 8 to 18 months. So co-financing is I'm sure you've heard of the terminology. It's been used before with donor funds where they pool money for various projects. But in this case, we're referring to public financing in a co-finance mechanism. And the reason that UNDP has been promoting it is that with the SDGs, there's really need to consider alternative funding mechanisms. So what this spiderweb tries to show is that the old silo public funding meant that, you know, one ministry, what we call Payer One, would fund specific interventions to achieve their health or their related SDGs. And so the funding would be in a siloed mechanism without much reference to the other ministries. What we are proposing is that there's cross-sectoral domestic co-financing whereby more than one ministry combines their funds to fund an intervention that has impact across many SDGs and thereby achieving each of the ministries' different mandates depending on what their particular goals are. This slide tries to show you kind of what the siloed problem is. So on the left-hand side, you'll see a program might have been costed and there might be X amount of money, the blue bar at the top. Sector A, the Ministry of Health might be willing to pay a small amount and education might pay another, and then social sector might pay another amount. But when they fund in isolation, obviously none of those 3 amounts would be sufficient in of themselves to achieve the total program cost, especially if you want to scale that program up. So what the willingness to pay, fairly simple idea, is rather for those 3 sectors to put their money together to fund that program, and therefore the program in theory would be funded and to scale because the funding is adequate when summed together. So we believe that co-financing can actually save governments money because we try and promote a better resource use and so greater efficiency by focusing on those high impact interventions that would have multiple benefits across different sectors. We also feel that these, what we call win-win interventions, are needed to realize those broad and interconnected SDGs. Otherwise, what tends to happen is that each sector only looks at their specific benefits and not seeing the greater welfare gain. So it's not necessarily about putting more money into the pot, but using the money that's already available within the public budgets a bit more strategically. And we hope that in that way there's more efficient use, and basically it would be guided by what each sector is willing to pay. Now that could be quite a complicated conversation or a modelling approach that the London School has been working on with UNDP to help the different ministries model what they could be willing to pay to contribute. As just this slide gives you some examples of the kind of multi-impact projects we were thinking of for co-financing. And here you can have a range of them, such as educational interventions that also have health outcomes, or health interventions within the schools that would obviously have impact on better educational performance and so on. And those are some fairly obvious ones. In terms of social protection and economic empowerment, actually cash transfers have been a very positive intervention with multiple outcomes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, as well as microfinancing and any kind of projects to empower adolescent girls and young women would have multiple outcomes. Environmental ones as well, again, obvious crossovers with the health sector, as well as such things as solar electrification and trying to reduce the imprint of utilization of resources in that way. Agriculture as well is another example where food diversification and fortification, as well as microfinancing options, all have health and agricultural and nutritional benefits, as well as environmental benefits. And similarly with nutrition and rural development. So a simple one on rural development is the building of roads that would increase access to health facilities, schools, new market areas, cultural buildings or places for the community to explore opportunities. So this tries to show in a very pretty graphic, I think, the Sambar pilot that was done a few years back now of cash transfers, conditional cash transfers to keep girls in school, that they also had numerous outcomes. So, for example, there was a 35% reduction in school dropout rates, 40% reduction in early marriages, 76% reduction in herpes virus infection, as well as reduction in teenage pregnancies, and importantly, 64% reduction in HIV risk. So obviously, these are impacts that interest the health sector, the HIV sector specifically, the educational sector, but also what's not shown here are other economic benefits to the household that participated in the study. So cash transfers, as I mentioned, are really a nice example where multiple ministries could contribute, scale up the project, and have greater impact for all of their goals. So what UNDP has been trying to do with the STRIVE project is to firstly raise awareness amongst senior policymakers and technical officers. They started with 4 countries and have expanded to 7. They're listed there. And they had initial training workshops, awareness raising workshops, and also facilitated technical working groups within the countries to try and move it forward. Some of the countries moved ahead with developing their concept notes as well, and UNDP has supported that process. And then the London School assisted the Malawian team to model their cash benefits, building off the Sambar model, to model the greater impact of scaling up that project, and then what each sector could potentially contribute to the project. That also fed into the Malawian integrated SDG report, which is coming out shortly, and really tries to deal with the issue of the intersectoralness of the SDGs. In addition, UNDP has offered continuing support to the countries, but I think it's important to state that for this to work, it really has to be country-led and have full country buy-in. So it's not a case of UNDP trying to push it, but rather build that enthusiasm and commitment to the process within the country. So I'll talk a bit more about that too. And also we've developed a guidance note and a lessons learned brief that will be available shortly online. The guidance note is available online, and the reference for that is at the end of this presentation. So of the 7 countries, 2, one chose not to continue and another kind of fell out because of changing staff and so on. So of the 5, these are the 5, and these are the projects that they chose to focus on. So Ghana have developed a concept note about improving children's pedestrian road safety in Accra. Tanzania have chosen the local government development grant for district development projects with health benefits, and that falls underneath their TASA program, which some of you may know was also includes the cash transfer grant, which was an initial focus of this project. But the big move has been at the district level and development of the district ability where to manage cross-sectoral projects. So this is where cofinancing fits in really nicely. In Malawi, as I mentioned, it is about scaling up their social cash transfer grant. In Lusaka, they chose the non-motorized transport infrastructure for a smart Lusaka city. And in South Africa, the project's been driven by SANAC, and they are wanting to expand the pilot project started with Global Fund money for the Cash Plus Care program for adolescent girls and young women. So, you know, co-financing, I think, makes logical sense to most of us and an obvious way to spend money better. But we have found many challenges in the field, and I'm going to go through some rather dense slides. I apologize for that. And I've broken them down into different kind of categories. And the first issue relates to what I alluded to, is that of a political buy-in. So we assisted countries to set up the coordination structures, and these were essential with senior representation from the various ministries to try and move the process forward. And what did work in a couple of countries was where they had very enthusiastic coordinators from the UNDP staff who really assisted with moving those forward and all the logistics and so on. And it required a fair amount of effort and should not be undermined. Without that, it couldn't have gone anywhere. Also, they needed the technical inputs and the costing and modeling, which is not so simple to have done on their own, and London School developed a model for that. But the big elephant really is always that public finance systems are slow to change, and it's not a simple decision made at one level that enables that to happen. It's this political process of having really good national leadership and buy-in, but all the ministries involved, and within the ministries, the different levels as well, right down to the kind of technocrats who have to make this work and think through what does this actually mean on various fronts in terms of both the budgeting and planning, but also then the execution, the funding channels, as well as the accounting for the funds, which seem to be quite challenging. And I think perhaps in this project we underestimated the amount of time that this political process takes. And I would say that certainly 2 years for this project was too short. It really needed, at least 5, I would say, to enable this political process to get underway before any practical kind of implementation could occur. We still kind of have posed the question, though, what does constitute real country ownership, leading to full adoption and implementation. Next slide, please, Becky. Thank you. What also took time was the selection of a suitable project. And that, again, is because you need all of those affected ministries to say, oh, yes, this is the one, we like this idea, we want to commit to it, and get all the persons involved, as we explained. So really it took some time. In fact, it took over 2 years to get to those concepts, and some of them changed over time, and people moved and so on. Also, what we found is that, I'm sure you're aware in your countries, that just planning in a cross-sectoral way is not common in many countries. It tends to happen at the district level and the local government level, but it's not that common at higher levels. And certainly cross-sectoral budgeting is almost non-existent. As I said, it's the siloed budgeting that dominates still. So this idea of joint financing is quite a new one. Also, as we said, each ministry has their particular mandate that they're interested in, and sometimes they can't think outside of that box or don't have the money to do so. And so it's really difficult to get them to think about co-financing a project, especially if they might actually be seen as competing incentives with other ministries. And as I've said, really getting the full buy-in of all the ministries at all levels took time. So I've also alluded to this issue of this public siloed budgeting and reform, and also not only the budgeting, but the execution and then the reporting and the accountability of it. So although we, on the technical working groups, there were Ministry of Finance representatives, and they in theory approved the idea. Of course, we in the time frame, we did not get the entire Ministry of Finance approval to pilot this mechanism or to try and implement it, because that took a lot of time. It's also about each ministry having to reallocate funds from within their routine budgets to the selected project. And as far as I'm aware, in Africa, not many ministries have spare money floating around that they can quickly say, here you go, we'll put this to it. So it's about that difficult juggling balance to actually reduce funds from one project to another, or to say this money that we've been spending on this educational project has not been yielding results, so we're going to put the money towards this co-finance one, which will have greater outcomes for the same objective of ours. Also, local government level, as I've mentioned, this really is a great level, I think, for piloting of co-financing. They already do cross-sectoral planning and budgeting to some extent. But in order for a project like this to gain approval, we found it took a lot of political discussions and debates about which districts or counties, and they have numerous levels of approvals within that system. And if the Malawian representative is here, they're welcome to comment on that, because in particular it was a very complex process. And in Kenya as well, the devolution process is going ahead well. And also, quite a number of ministries said to us, we're concerned about pooling our funds and then those monies being misused or not accounted for well. And so really critical would be tight execution and control of the funds and monitoring with really good accountability and good performance monitoring, so that it builds confidence and maintains the commitment of all the ministries. Next slide, please. So we also found that, the technical working group was great. We had senior official members in most of the countries, but they of themselves cannot make those decisions individually, as I've said. And even where those technical working groups did develop detailed work plans and actions, their implementation was delayed. And I think that's because they were all very busy on their own projects, and the co-financing had not yet been formally put as one of their annual performance indicators or targets. And so it wasn't really fully internalized yet, and as I said, that would take time too. Also, we learned that you can't build parallel technical working groups. That's rather inefficient, and there are many already. So rather embedded the idea within existing cross-sectoral planning bodies. So as I mentioned, the district planning, but also the CCMs set up by global funds have most ministries represented there, key ones, and so offers a good opportunity. And also, to try to start a new project from scratch really takes a lot longer. Rather build within an existing project, and especially where one is funded by external funding. So I mentioned the South African case where the Global Fund had piloted the Cash Plus Care project, and it was, it's already existing, the implementers are in place, the reporting mechanisms are there, so that really would be a lot easier for public departments then to come and contribute funds. And certainly in KZN, I'm not sure if there's a KZN rep here, but they were extremely successful at getting in-kind contributions from various ministries or departments, as we call them, and that was very successful. So, co-financing possibly does not need to only be about money, but also various in-kind contributions as well. Next slide, please.
So Doug has offered to take over, as we seem to have lost Teresa. And if you can pick up on this page. Doug, can we hear you?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes. If you can carry on, Teresa, I'm so sorry. We seem to have lost you. So if that's okay with you, Doug's going to just keep going.
Sure. There's not much more to say here. Greetings from New York, everybody. Just to finish off this conversation about the co-financing and what we've learned through trying this out. The general message, going through the slide here, is that the public budgeting processes are extremely rigid and full of pre-existing tensions, essentially, that an external actor like us, as in the UN, is quite... We find it very challenging to infiltrate, especially when the money being discussed or the assets being scrutinized are public budgets, are public government budgets. And there's a concern that we had from governments that this was a high risk strategy in a sense, which was not then conducive to experimentation, which is really what we were trying to do. We were trying to move from proof of concept to behavioral change in terms of budgeting. So we found that even if you convinced a few individuals who had to go through a sensitization process of the modeling and the theory, they themselves, as sort of mini champions in a public budgeting system, struggled to influence all the right people. And even when we had fairly high level commitment in ministries of finance, I'm thinking of Tanzania as an example here, that commitment didn't necessarily then filter through to the multiple levels of government. And as Teresa has just been saying, we did feel that the appropriate scale of piloting here was certainly district or subnational. So you do need multiple layers of bureaucrats, in a sense, to buy in and then persuade other actors in the system that this was a good idea. So I think we've gone through the learnings, and I'll if you go to the next slide, we can think about what we do from here on in. So it sounds as if this was a sort of a catalogue of bad news in terms of impacts, but I'm quite upbeat about the future on this, despite the sort of lack of sort of apparent progress. If we look forward from here, this year is a big year for universal health coverage. 2019 has the high-level meeting on UHC in the General Assembly in September, where we're expecting some significant commitments to be made. And within that conversation, there is a lot of stress on the idea of efficiencies and investments, and the move from considering UHC as a sort of a huge public cost to the taxpayer, essentially, to an investment in particularly human capital development. So this idea that UHC is a developmental process for countries with economic growth and human capital gains is an important one, and the G20 is also saluting this idea at the moment in their conversations. Tied closely to that, I think, is this notion that universal health coverage and other closely aligned objectives, particularly pandemic preparedness, are two areas of investment which really should be tied together. And there's increasing recognition that UHC and the implementation of the international health regulations are actually one and the same thing. And we're seeing, watching the Ebola response in the Congo right now, we realize that, we point the fingers at UHC failures, which allow a pandemic sort of crisis to unfold. So there's increasingly the need, in my view, to bring these two big financing blocks into the same conversation. And I think that the co-financing methodology is absolutely prime for this. And I'm working with colleagues to move this forward. And this links with a broader conversation around disaster risk reduction financing. Another area which I think has a huge potential, and I'm getting a lot of interest from our environment colleagues here, is the issue around health, climate change, and environmental change and biodiversity. We are looking more and more at the sweet spot in the SDGs between environment, social, and economic domains of interest. And for example, the recent data coming out of Bangladesh, which indicates that rising seawater levels is inundating sort of coastal agriculture and causing the salination of coastal freshwater wells and aquifers, which is then linked to not only agricultural decline due to salination, but increasing incidence of preeclampsia and hypertension and issues around birthing problems, as well as chronic diseases linked to hypertension and diabetes. So this is a direct relationship between environmental degradation, absence of sort of coastal mitigation and planning, and health impact. So again, these cross-sector intentions and objective sets can be tied in with a single intervention, which in this case would be coastal management and coastal protection. Even within the ministries of health, we're talking here about cross-sector, but there are tensions within ministries of health around different disease clusters or disease silos. And I'm a strong believer that comorbidities is an entry point for looking at different objective sets in the same interventions, particularly the areas of tuberculosis, HIV, tobacco use and alcohol. I think there are huge gains to be made in looking at those interactions in the same financing sort of frame. We are, as the UN Development Programme, taking these ideas quite seriously through a stress on what we call accelerators. These are the parts of the Sustainable Development Agenda which are most sort of valuable. These are the areas of investment which have the biggest impact, the biggest bang for the buck across the SDG targets. So these accelerators are being looked at more and more at country level through our accelerator labs. There are about 60 of these now being developed, and I'm hopeful the co-finance idea fits in nicely with essentially policy experimentation to identify and finance these accelerator interventions, which this method would be perfect for. At the same time, with the flatlining and demise of international development assistance for health, there are countries who are struggling with the idea of picking up the tab for big cost items like HIV and antiretroviral treatment purchase. So integrating these ideas of efficiencies through co-financing within countries undergoing transitional financing, I think is a win-win for everybody. But again, we need to target those parts of the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance most concerned with this transitional financing of the big institutions. Social impact bonds, I think, have potential. Again, you'd need investors who are sort of looking at social impacts and willing to experiment. But the financing of these accelerator interventions, which have multiple impacts, lends itself to a social impact bond structure. And Teresa could probably speak more to those going on in South Africa. We are experimenting with bond structures all over the world. One I'm closely involved in is in Zambia regarding transitioning tobacco farmers to alternative crops, which requires capital up front, but the impacts are multiple across different objective sets within government. I think, as Teresa said, the demand must come from government, and we've struggled with this idea of ownership. And I think we were naive in coming in with a good sort of model and just expecting governments to jump on it and change their behaviors accordingly. This must come from government itself, and especially within ongoing financing and political processes, such as devolution to district level like in Kenya. So having these ideas within the overall structure and design from the onset of the work is important, rather than trying to come in, sneak in the side and say, well, how about doing it differently? It needs to be built in right from the very beginning with pre-existing projects, pre-existing financial commitments, and the ownership of the actors involved, rather than tinkering, in a sense, with a budgeting mechanism at a later point, which is essentially what we were trying to do. Having said all that, the technical working groups are still there, they're still active, and we're in touch with them. So it's the second part of the experiment is to see what the sustainability of these models and these working groups is as they try and influence their various projects around the country. So we're hopeful that South Africa, Tanzania especially, will carry the work. And that itself is very well worth sort of keeping an eye on to see whether the seed will grow in any form and what shape it will take in those countries. So next slide. So we are, you know, sort of, in many ways, I'm personally quite optimistic, given the support and encouragement that we have from colleagues who are spending much of their professional time figuring out with governments how to finance the SDGs. And there's an enormous amount of interest in the adaptation of this model and this approach to SDG financing. And we've got a lot of sort of ongoing conversations, particularly in Southeast Asia, with governments about this, how this works. And we've already used it in Malawi through this ISDG modeling process. So it had unintended consequences, I think, and it moving well beyond HIV universal health coverage. But we are interested really in how these ideas resonate in different public spheres of financing interest. You know, if you do have ideas about where this would be relevant, we'd love to hear them, and what you feel would be the conditions in which this approach can thrive. We simply haven't nailed it down. We've listed out a whole bunch of constraints, and we can hypothesize about what's required, but I don't think we're quite yet there with the sort of the right enabling environment for this to take off. So where this has potential, or where you feel that this is already happening, we didn't know about it, would be very helpful. So just trying to summarize a very big, complicated experiment, and would be very interested in your feedback. I'll finish there. Oh, hang on, there's one more slide. There is a new guidance note that we've developed with STRIVE colleagues, supported by Japan, which tries to explain what we've just said in a guidance note form. So it walks the reader basically through the theory and the method and its potential for application. And this went onto the website, the STRIVE website. I think it went onto our website a couple of weeks ago. So I'm now working with my colleagues across the UNDP and the UN Development Group, actually, in taking this forward through much bigger macro level financing conversations across multiple countries. So out of this, I think there's some oak trees that are going to grow, but I'm just pushing ahead now with trying to figure out how that'll work. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
So this is the point where we thank Doug and Teresa for a start, but also open up for questions and comments. I think Doug, towards the end there, has asked for input and suggestions and questions. Anyone have experience in anything similar to this, or know of anything that resonates with this model and the interesting and complicated way we have to understand the political context before we can work towards implementation? You can either unmute yourself, or you can type your question into the question box. I think it's usually on the left or below your screen. So it would be great to have questions or comments from everyone, the people on the call, people on the webinar, thinking about potential implementation from your point of view in your context. I was particularly interested, obviously I work in research uptake, so for me this is an absolutely in-depth, detailed, gritty examination of what it takes to get a good concept into integrated within processes at national, or perhaps, as you said, most usefully originally at district or provincial or regional level. And you touched on the question of integrating the process of taking this forward with devolution, for example, in Tanzania. And I wondered if you had, I believe there were examples where this model worked quite well in cities in Europe. And I wondered if you had any further comments about the level at which, at least initially, it makes sense to try this out. Doug or Teresa?
I can start, and I'm interested in Teresa's perception here. The working hypothesis that we have is that you will see greater success at a more localized level. Partly because I think we should have had more behavioral insights thinking in the way that this would work. I think what we're seeing is a fear of failure. I think is much greater than the assessment of the benefit derived from doing this. So the scale then becomes important, because doing this at a federal or national level, that it is a highly risky maneuver when you have a set pattern of work that's going on and a set pattern of institutional behaviors, and fiddling with that is an enormous sort of shift in the way that the machine operates. So going down to a local level, and most of the examples we've ever found where this is even close to working is at a city municipal level, particularly because you've got the actors themselves who are much more probably in touch with each other. They have a more direct relationship with their constituencies, and I think there's probably a greater ownership around collective success or failure. And you probably have an accountability structure which is much more tight compared to the national level. So I do think that this has got great resonance at a more localized, or at least a planning environment which has clearer boundaries and accountability structures within it. But Teresa, I'd be interested in what you think there.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. No, I completely agree with you. And certainly the enthusiasm that we experienced from county level was very high, and they could identify with the concept far more easily, because they already implemented, as you've said, to some degree. They already have their cross-sectoral planning, their groups where they have closer relationships and so on. And also importantly, many countries have these block grants that go to districts or counties, and they then have full autonomy to decide how to split that money. And I remember one councillor in Kenya told me that, they have very little information to help them decide how to split that money. It's not huge amounts of money, but he said that if they had some modeling that could show the impact of $1 spent here versus another one there, and if they could show these kind of cross-sectoral benefits, he said that would help them enormously and get the buy-in of all the sectors to agree to such a project. So certainly I agree. I think the county district level or the provincial level, in the case of South Africa, it's the KZN province that are driving it forward as well. So yeah, thank you.
That's great. We have one comment from Clive Mutunga saying USAID has lessons to share on cross-sectoral integration of population health and environment, PHE, activities globally. Clive, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and speak to that, or Doug or Teresa, if you want to comment.
Could Clive give us a bit more insight into that situation, please?
That would be great. Could you do that, Clive? Maybe if you could share a link or something like that. In the meantime, I'm aware that quite a few of the people on this webinar are coming from a research background. And from the STRIVE point of view, our strategy with this model was to proceed on two fronts. One is to, obviously, this extremely interesting work with UNDP in practice, getting doing the pilots to see how that might work in practice. But on the other side, also ensuring academic viability and credibility of the model. And I wondered if, looking ahead as you take this forward, Doug and Teresa, where you see the areas that would benefit from ongoing research and new studies to support and evaluate the process.
It's a good question. I'll tackle that first. I think that we've hinted that understanding the political economy of financing is something that is absolutely important. Now, this might be a different domain. This would be for political scientists or economists dealing with public administration. But I think we just underestimated the sort of the challenges we'd come up against within public administration thinking and the way that value is assessed and communicated. And we're seeing this in other spheres at the moment through doing various return on investment analyses. And you come up with a return on investment analysis which gives you a sort of a fairly healthy ratio of investment to benefit. And then you, of course, realize that the Ministry of Finance is being bombarded with the return on investment analyses from all over the place. So it's not the veracity of the modelling which is the question; it's the value of the conversation or the relationship between the different ministries and who the Ministry of Finance trusts on any particular day. So the political economy question is, I think the other one is the data question, specifically around the willingness to pay thresholds. And to sort of, I think the co-financing model relies very heavily on an acceptance of this notion of willingness to pay thresholds from a particular payer. And very often when people say, oh yes, co-financing, well, we're doing that already, what they mean is they're doing pool financing, which is not based on a willingness to pay threshold, which determines the value to the payer, which is a slight difference of this model. So understanding these willingness to pay thresholds and the differential values of outcomes to different payers, I think is a really important research area, because reliance on proxy data and reliance on foreign data for these models is always going to be a constraint. So localized data, which is locally generated to input into the models, can only enhance ownership. And at the moment, I think that ownership is challenged by the fact that a lot of the data coming in is external to the environment itself.
Well, that certainly connects with what you were saying about saying earlier about the comment that Teresa made about people saying if we could generate some of the modeling or be able to demonstrate this in our own context, it would be a great deal easier to make the argument. So we have someone called Steve Cohen. Steve is connected through the toll-free line. I think, Steve, if we sort of need to know if you're connected through the toll-free line, you can unmute yourself on your handset by dialing *7. We've muted you, but you can unmute yourself with *7, and we would love to hear your question or comment. I'm hoping you're there.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Great. What fantastic technology. And thanks for a very interesting presentation, Teresa and Doug. As you know, I've been working in South Africa on some of the tasks around multi-sectoral planning, and then found it really interesting. And especially the opportunities at the end of the presentation around its potential contribution to the UHC and the SDG agenda. I just wanted to make a comment around some of the challenges that we experienced in this phase of work, and maybe just make a couple of suggestions that you probably already considered. One of the big challenges mentioned was around the rigidity of public financial management and budgeting, and resource allocation. And it seems that the approach taken was to the entry point. There was already discussion around, pooling of funding and co-financing, and I think that may have, created early barriers which are not necessary to achieve what co-financing is really about. For me, perhaps the entry point should have more emphasis on, what greater or improved outcomes you want to achieve across sectors, and have early discussions around, improving a specific outcome around adolescent and girl and young women health, around decreasing pregnancy rates, etc. And then looking how that can be achieved through a theory of change. And, obviously coming in with technical assistance around modeling and so on to develop different scenarios in terms of outcomes, impacts, and costs. And once stakeholders have clarity and consensus around the specific outcomes they want to achieve, that's when you can move to discussions around financing. And, for me, it seems that it may be more feasible to have different public sectors just committing to invest in specific activities and interventions, rather than, trying to change public systems to pool funding. If there is a commitment in terms of a shared results framework with specific outputs and outcomes that each ministry or department commits to, then it's up to them to make sure that they mobilize and reallocate resources to achieve that impact. So that was my main point, and I think the important thing around is how to strengthen those accountability and coordination structures to achieve the different sector commitments to achieving those multi-sectoral outcomes. Sorry, that was a very long comment, but it's a really interesting topic.
Steve, yes, I mean, I know. Yeah, just to jump in, I think that's an important observation. I know you've thought a lot about this, so appreciate your feedback. There's two elements I think which are relevant here. One is this idea of whole of government financing rather than sectoral financing, and I think that's a conceptual jump which we are not yet necessarily seeing within our government counterparts. The second part is around when the movement of the money actually happens, and I'm pretty convinced that it's far easier to pre-allocate to these interventions at the Ministry of Finance level, as you said, within a sort of a shared results framework development. You put the money towards the interventions at that point, rather than allocating money to sectors and then expecting people to give it all back again, or to then say, well, give it to the Ministry of Education because they're doing something which you might find useful. I think there's a psychological difference there. So it does come back to what Teresa was describing in Kenya, where you have integrated planning, and then you've got a fiscal agent which has the authority to allocate resources to interventions which are recognized as being beneficial across different siloed budget holders, rather than giving money away and expecting the conversation to persuade people to give a fraction of it back. So I think you're hitting the nail on the head there.
That's great. We have reached the end of the official time, but if people want to stay on for a couple of minutes, we're happy to keep going. Briefly, obviously, and we have Clive Mutunga is now able to give us a response to giving a bit more information about the USAID experience. Clive, can you unmute yourself by pressing star 7? That's if you're on a landline. Alternatively, if you're on the computer-based audio, there's an option to unmute yourself on the dialog box there. Okay. So anyway, we will hope to hear more from Clive, maybe by email or some other way, if we can't hear your actual voice, Clive. And so, on that note, I'd like to thank Teresa and Doug enormously for joining us today and for this extremely interesting conversation, which I'm sure will continue in one way or another. As you see on your screen, there is a link to the website where we post all our presentations, all our webinars. So you will be able to revisit this one and see the slides again as a PDF in a few days' time. And you can also see many of the almost 60 other learning labs we've hosted in the past nearly 8 years.